bum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-da-dum bum ba-dum bum ba-dum bum bum ba-dum bum bum.
Welcome to Everyday Musicality, the podcast in which we discuss all things related to Gordon's music learning theory and how it can help unlock the inner musician that lives inside of all of us. I'm your host, Heather Shouldice, music educator and faculty member for the Gordon Institute for Music Learning. In this episode, I give an overview of the first level of the skill learning sequence, Aural. Hello and welcome to the Everyday Musicality podcast. Today I'm kicking off a new mini-series of episodes where we'll dig into the first level of Gordon's skill learning sequence. Remember, the skill learning sequence is the theoretical framework at the heart of MLT, which provides possible pathways for the sequencing of how students learn musical skills. This is so important because one of the core tenets of MLT is sequential learning, that we learn music easily and naturally if we are allowed to learn in a sequential way. Back in episode 3, I talked about this core tenet of sequential learning, and in episode 9, I gave an overview of the skill learning sequence. I'll link to both of those episodes in the show notes in case you want to check them out. As I discussed in episode 9, the skill learning sequence provides possible pathways for learning musical content through the development of various musical skills, and this is structured into two types of learning: discrimination learning and inference learning. Remember that in discrimination learning, students learn skills by rote using familiar material. And then in inference learning, students apply the skills they learned in discrimination learning to teach themselves unfamiliar musical material or to create new musical material. In this mini-series of episodes, I'll be focusing on the first level of the skill learning sequence, Aural. Before I talk about Aural, however, I want to remind you that the skill learning sequence is a framework for formal instruction in music. I talked about the differences between formal instruction and informal guidance back in episode 13, so check that one out if you want a refresher on the differences between informal guidance and formal instruction. In order to benefit fully, it is crucial that students come to formal music instruction with the appropriate readiness. When students don't have sufficient readiness for formal instruction, learning tends to happen very slowly or it takes a lot of excessive effort. If you find yourself frustrated by students' confusion or lack of progress, if it's like pulling teeth to get your students to understand something, it's likely because they lack adequate readiness for the skills and content you're trying to teach them. So before we begin formal instruction through the skill learning sequence, it's important that we first help students gain the readiness for formal instruction by helping them develop a rich musical listening vocabulary and helping them progress through tonal and rhythm babble and into audiation. I talk about all these ideas back in episodes 13, 14, and 15, so check those out if you want to know more about those concepts. One thing to consider before beginning formal instruction is that formal instruction is only appropriate once your students are audiating. When the majority of your students in a given class are audiating, then they are ready for formal instruction. You'll still want to continue to provide some informal guidance experiences for your students who aren't yet audiating, and also informal guidance with less familiar tonalities and meters. But you can begin formal instruction in the more common tonalities, meters, and functions. When students are ready to begin formal instruction, you can start at the first level of the skill learning sequence, which is the Aural level. The Aural, A-U-R-A-L, refers to listening, and the Aural, O-R-A-L, refers to performing. Now, performing doesn't necessarily mean performing for other people, but performing simply means making music, which could include singing, chanting, playing instruments by ear, not through notation, and moving to music. So at the Aural skill level, students are learning by listening and doing, Aural. Content performed at the Aural level can include familiar tonal patterns and rhythm patterns, as well as the resting tone and macrobeat and microbeat of familiar songs or chants. Listening also includes recognizing familiar patterns, such as recognizing where a familiar pattern occurs in a song or chant. Because the purpose of aural learning is to develop a vocabulary of musical sounds prior to the addition of signs or symbols, learning at the aural skill level occurs without the use of solfege or music notation. Instead of solfege, skills are performed on a neutral syllable. This neutral syllable can be any vocable that doesn't imply any musical meaning. For example, Gordon recommended the syllable bum for singing and ba for chanting. So for singing, we might sing bum bum, bum 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 bum, bum bum bum. For chanting, we might say ba 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 ba. Although neutral syllables should be used when singing tonal patterns and resting tone, and when chanting rhythm patterns and the macrobeat or microbeat, it is okay to perform entire songs or chants on either neutral syllables or on lyrics. However, keep in mind that use of lyrics can distract students from focusing on the music itself and may encourage use of speaking voice rather than singing voice. Therefore, it's important that students be given ample opportunities to listen to and perform songs and chants on neutral syllables. Since aural is the first level of discrimination learning, remember that students learn by rote in response to a musical model. Therefore, the teacher should be sure to demonstrate all skills for students rather than asking them to make inferences. For example, asking students to independently find and sing the resting tone on a neutral syllable wouldn't be an aural skill. It would be a generalization skill because you would be expecting the students to independently determine where the resting tone is using their audiation. At the aural level, the teacher would model the resting tone of the song for the students before asking them to sing it. Asking students to independently find and sing the resting tone isn't inherently problematic as long as you realize you're asking students to make an inference. The problem is when a teacher inadvertently asks students to generalize without realizing that's what they're doing. And then they're surprised when students struggle. So we need to be purposeful about when and how we bridge to inference learning and be conscious of how students' readiness for inference learning relates to their success with inference learning. So at the aural skill level, we have to always be conscious of whether we are giving students the answer by modeling skills before asking them to respond. For this reason, I like to use the verb recognize when talking about many of the skills performed in levels of discrimination learning, such as students recognize and sing the resting tone on a neutral syllable. Students recognize where a familiar pattern happens in a song, and that would imply that the teacher has previously modeled the answer for students. They're recognizing. I use the verb identify when talking about inference learning. Identify implies that the students haven't already been giving the answer and instead are independently inferring the answer. So, for example, students identify the resting tone of a familiar song implies that they themselves are using their audiation to find that resting tone by making a generalization. So again, recognize implies that students have already been given the answer, while identify implies that they haven't been given the answer and instead are independently inferring the answer. So students are not identifying at the aural level. We'll talk about that later when we talk about bridging to inference learning from the aural level. So today's episode was just meant to give you a sense of the essence of what goes on at the aural skill level. And then in the next few episodes, we're really going to dig into teaching and learning at the aural skill level. In the next episode, I'll talk about tonal skills learned at aural. Then I'll talk about rhythm skills learned at aural after that. And finally, I'll talk about bridging to inference learning from the aural skill level in the last episode of this mini-series. In the meantime, if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for future episodes, please get in touch. You can email me or send me a voice memo at everydaymusicality@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and let's keep musicking every day.